The interstellar diplomatic station orbiting the luminous gas giant of Yorma was a masterpiece of alien engineering. Its sweeping, crystalline corridors seemed to hum with purpose, hosting emissaries from across the galaxy. They came adorned in robes of shifting nanofibers or bioorganic exosuits, their voices a symphony of hisses, clicks, and guttural tones. The station was a beacon of collaboration, a place where peace was negotiated, grievances aired, and sometimes, in the human's case, chaos quietly unfolded. Lieutenant Jake Marlowe didn't consider himself an agent of chaos. Yet somehow, he always found himself in the middle of it. Remember, Lieutenant Earth's representative, Commander Mert, had warned that morning the Veqeth aren't like us. They're proud, traditional, and very sensitive about their Korlax. You're here to observe and speak when spoken to. That's it. No Jake Marlowe charm. Charm? I have no idea what you're talking about, Jake had replied, straightening his uniform with a grin that could disarm a warlord. Now, standing in the council chamber, Jake found himself face to face, or rather, face to muzzle with the source of all the fuss, a Korlak. The Veqeth delegation had brought the creature as a silent reminder of their cultural supremacy. Standing 8 feet tall on all fours, the beast exuded raw power. Its obsidian fur shimmered with an almost metallic sheen, while its yellow eyes radiated a predatory intensity that made Jake's skin crawl. To the Veqeth, Korlax were not just apex predators but symbols of their civilization's might and discipline. They were sacred. The handler, a towering Veqeth named Arvex, stood nearby. His dark green scales gleamed under the chamber's soft lights as he leaned toward Jake. "Lieutenant Marlowe, you will adhere to protocol," Arvex hissed, his forked tongue flicking for emphasis. "No sudden movements. No speaking to the Korlak. No. No baby talk, no belly rubs." "Got it," Jake said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Arvex's slit-pupiled eyes narrowed, his tail flicking with annoyance. "Humans," he muttered under his breath, then turned his attention back to the council proceedings. Jake tried to focus too, but his attention kept drifting back to the Korlak. The beast lay at Arvex's feet, coiled like a storm, waiting to strike, and yet there was something familiar in its behavior. It scratched at its ear with a massive paw, yawned, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, huffed as if bored out of its mind. Jake stifled a chuckle. "Big scary monster, huh," he thought. But then the Korlak did something surprising. It glanced at Jake. Its head tilted slightly, as though it was assessing him. For a moment their eyes locked and Jake felt a strange pull. He grinned instinctively. Eyes front, human Arvex snapped, startling Jake out of his reverie. "Right, eyes front." "Got it," Jake muttered, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the Korlak had just sized him up and found him interesting. Later, Jake sought refuge in the Arboretum. The sprawling biodome was a haven of greenery, filled with alien plants that glowed, hummed, or emitted faint, pleasant smells. For Jake, it was the perfect place to clear his head and escape the intensity of the council chambers. He was midway through inspecting a plant that looked like a cross between a fern and a disco ball when he heard it a low, rumbling growl. Turning slowly, Jake saw the last thing he expected: the Korlak. Hey there, big guy," Jake said, instinctively raising his hands. The beast's handler, Arvex, was nowhere to be seen. The Korlak stepped out from the underbrush, its glowing eyes locked on Jake. Each movement was deliberate, its muscles rippling beneath its dark coat. Jake's heart raced. "Lost your babysitter," Jake ventured. The Korlak growled again, though it didn't sound threatening, more like a warning. Jake slowly crouched, making himself appear smaller. "Easy," he murmured. "I'm not here to bother you." The Korlak took another step forward, sniffing the air between them, its massive head lowered, coming within inches of Jake's face. Jake's instincts screamed at him to stay still. He held his breath as the creature sniffed him again, its hot, humid breath washing over him. Then, to his utter disbelief, the Korlak licked him. "Ho!" Jake exclaimed, falling backward. The beast let out a low sound somewhere between a growl and a chuff. It almost sounded like laughter. Jake stared at the Korlak, who now sat calmly, wagging its tail ever so slightly. "You're not as scary as you look, are you?" Jake said cautiously. The Korlak tilted its head, as if considering the statement. Jake hesitated, then extended a hand. The beast sniffed it, then nudged it with its massive snout. "You're just a big old puppy," Jake said with a grin, scratching behind its ears. The Korlak closed its eyes, leaning into the touch. When Arvex finally found them, his reaction was nothing short of apocalyptic. "What is this?" Arvex roared, his voice echoing through the arboretum. Jake, who had been scratching the Korlak's belly, looked up sheepishly. "A bonding." "Bonding?" Arvex's scales flared with indignation. "You've desecrated him. You've corrupted him." Jake frowned. "Corrupted? He seems pretty happy to me." "Vyrkon is not supposed to be happy," Arvex hissed, gesturing wildly at the Korlak. "He is a warrior, a hunter, not some domesticated plaything." Jake looked down at Vyrkon, who was now rolling onto his back, paws in the air, tongue lolling out. Looks like nobody told him that. Arvex's claws twitched as though he were fighting the urge to throttle Jake. "This is a disgrace. An affront to Veqeth culture. I demand a council hearing." Okay, Jake said, raising his hands. "But let's not lose sight of the positives here. If I can get along with your fiercest predator, imagine what this could mean for human-Veqeth relations." Arvex sputtered incoherently, his tail lashing like a whip. Finally, he stormed off, muttering something about filing an official complaint. Jake sighed, leaning back against a tree. Vyrkon let out a contented huff and rested his massive head on Jake's lap. "Well, buddy," Jake said, scratching the Korlak's ears, "I think we just made history. Or maybe the weirdest headline in galactic news." As word of the encounter spread, reactions across the station were mixed. The Veqeth were outraged, viewing Jake's actions as an insult to their traditions. Other species, however, were intrigued, flocking to the arboretum to catch a glimpse of the unlikely pair. For Jake, it was clear that his bond with Vyrkon was only the beginning of something much larger and much more complicated. The diplomatic station had seen its fair share of peculiar incidents, but Jake and Vyrkon's arboretum encounter had sparked a level of controversy no one could ignore. Overnight, the story of the human who befriended a Korlak spread across the station's vast network. Delegates gossiped in hushed tones, security personnel whispered about the human lunatic, and alien journalists clamored to get interviews with Jake. For Jake, the attention was exhausting. Everywhere he went, he was met with pointed stares and quiet murmurs. Vyrkon, now fully committed to shadowing Jake like an oversized, fluffy bodyguard, didn't help matters. His sheer presence sent station staff scrambling to find alternate routes whenever the pair approached. Jake Commander Mert said, her tone somewhere between amused and exasperated as Jake strolled into the Earth delegation's office with Vyrkon in tow. "Do you know how many complaints I've had to field since yesterday?" 10? 20, Jake guessed, leaning against a desk. 34, Mert snapped. From 14 different species. Jake winced. "That's thorough. Thorough is what the Veqeth are going to be when they flay you alive for this." Jake glanced down at Vyrkon, who was lying sprawled across the floor, chewing lazily on what looked like a piece of alien bone. "Come on, Commander, he's harmless." Harmless, Mert's voice climbed an octave. "Jake, that thing is 8 feet of apex predator. You've turned the galaxy's most feared hunter into a glorified house pet." Jake grinned. "I think he likes me." Mert groaned, rubbing her temples. "The Veqeth don't like anyone, Jake. They tolerate us because we've proven we're useful. But this looks like you're making a mockery of their traditions. Do you know what's at stake here?" Jake's grin faded. He understood. The Veqeth were a cornerstone of the Galactic Alliance. Their military power and strategic prowess made them invaluable, but their rigid traditions also made them hard to negotiate with. Anything that undermined their authority, like a human cuddling their sacred predator, could jeopardize Earth's fragile relationship with them. "Look," Jake said, trying to sound more serious, "I didn't plan for this to happen. Vyrkon chose me. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it means there's room for something new in all these old traditions. Mert stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. You're impossible. But the Veqeth have filed a formal grievance. The council is meeting tomorrow to decide what happens next. Try not to do anything stupider until then. The next morning, the council chamber was packed. Delegates from dozens of species crowded the circular room, their murmurs creating a low, uneasy buzz. At the center stood Jake and Vyrkon, flanked by Commander Mert and a translator drone. Across from them was Arvex, his scales gleaming with righteous indignation. Honored representatives, Arvex began, his voice a low, menacing hiss. This human has insulted the very foundation of Veqeth culture. The Korlak bond is sacred, a testament to our discipline and strength. For a human to claim such a bond is not only absurd but a blatant affront to our honor. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Collar, the crystalline chairperson of the council, turned to Jake. Lieutenant Marlowe, do you have a response? Jake stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. With respect to the Veqeth, I didn't claim anything. Vyrkon approached me. He made a choice, and I respected it. If that's a problem, then maybe we need to rethink what this bond really means. Arvex snarled, his tail lashing. You dare suggest that a Korlak would choose you over its Veqeth handler? Preposterous. Jake shrugged. Then how do you explain this? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of dried meat, a universal snack, as it turned out. At the sight of it, Vyrkon's ears perked up, and his massive tail thumped against the floor. Jake tossed the meat into the air, and Vyrkon snatched it effortlessly, chomping it down with a satisfied growl. The room erupted in gasps, some of shock, others of amusement. Arvex, however, looked as though he might combust on the spot. This is an outrage, Arvex bellowed. Korlaks do not beg for scraps like some domesticated animal. But Jake folded his arms. Looks like this one does. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Kaller raised a crystalline hand, silencing the commotion. Enough, Kaller said, their voice resonating like a chime. The council will deliberate on this matter. Lieutenant Marlowe, until a decision is reached, you and Vyrkon are confined to the human quarters. Is that understood? Jake nodded. Understood. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Arvex glaring at him, his slitted eyes burning with fury. Jake had a sinking feeling that the Veqeth leader wasn't done with him yet. Back in the human quarters, Jake slumped onto his bunk, exhausted. Vyrkon settled down beside him, resting his massive head on Jake's lap. Well, buddy, Jake said, scratching behind Vyrkon's ears, looks like we've got some powerful enemies now. Hope you're ready for whatever comes next. Vyrkon rumbled softly, his tail wagging. The days that followed were tense. Rumors swirled that the Veqeth were threatening to leave the Alliance entirely if their grievance wasn't addressed. Some species sympathized with them, viewing Jake's actions as a breach of cultural respect. Others saw it as an opportunity to challenge the Veqeth's dominance in galactic politics. Meanwhile, Jake and Vyrkon became an unlikely attraction. Delegates, staff, and even security personnel stopped by the human quarters, curious to see the tamed Korlak for themselves. One visitor was Ulnar, a diminutive amphibious diplomat from Sepsithar. Clad in a shimmering, water-repellent suit, Ulnar waddled into the room, his wide, frog-like eyes blinking in wonder. Incredible, Ulnar croaked, staring at Vyrkon. The Veqeth say these creatures are uncontrollable outside of their handlers. Jake grinned. Yeah, well, maybe Vyrkon's got good taste in friends. Ulnar chuckled, extending a webbed hand toward the Korlak. Vyrkon sniffed it briefly, then gave it a gentle lick, causing the amphibian to let out a delighted squeak. Fascinating, Ulnar said, turning to Jake. If I may ask, what is the secret to your bond? Jake shrugged. Honestly, I just treated him like I would any dog. Respect, patience, and snacks. Dog, Ulnar blinked. Is that another Earth predator? Kind of, Jake replied. On Earth, there are companions. Loyal, smart, and always up for an adventure. I think Vyrkon's got a bit of that in him. As the council deliberated, tensions between Jake and the Veqeth only grew. Behind the scenes, Arvex plotted a way to take Vyrkon back, one that wouldn't involve waiting for the council's decision. Late one night, while Jake and Vyrkon slept, a team of Veqeth operatives infiltrated the human quarters. Their mission: retrieve Vyrkon and return him to Veqeth custody for reconditioning. The operatives moved silently, their sleek forms blending into the shadows. But as they approached the slumbering Korlak, Vyrkon's eyes snapped open. What followed was a cacophony of growls, shouts, and the unmistakable sound of furniture being upended. Jake woke to find Vyrkon standing protectively over him, his teeth bared and his fur bristling. "What the hell?" Jake shouted, grabbing a nearby lamp as an improvised weapon. Arvex stepped forward, his voice a venomous hiss. "You have no claim to that Korlak. We are taking him back." Jake squared his shoulders. "Over my dead body." Vyrkon let out a thunderous roar, shaking the walls and freezing the Veqeth operatives in their tracks. For a moment, it seemed like the situation might escalate into violence. But then Vyrkon did something unexpected. He stepped forward and let out a low, rumbling growl, not threatening, but firm. He nudged Jake gently, as if urging him to stand down, then turned to face Arvex, his tail wagging faintly. Jake frowned. "What's he doing?" Arvex stared, his fury giving way to confusion. I don't know." Vyrkon barked softly, his posture calm but confident. It was as if he were offering a truce. Jake sighed. "Looks like he's got more diplomacy in him than either of us." The Veqeth operatives hesitated, then slowly retreated under Arvex's orders. But the look in Arvex's eyes made one thing clear: this wasn't over. The attempted Korlak abduction sent shockwaves through the station. News spread rapidly, and within hours, the story dominated interstellar broadcasts. The Veqeth's covert operation drew widespread condemnation, with several species calling their actions reckless and dishonorable. For Jake and Vyrkon, the fallout only deepened the scrutiny they faced. Jake found himself summoned to yet another emergency council meeting, this time held in a larger chamber to accommodate the surge of attendees. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the unspoken question: would the bond between a human and a Korlak tear the alliance apart? Kaller, the crystalline council chairperson, struck the table with a chiming gesture to call for order. The light refracted through their translucent forms seemed sharper today, more severe. "This situation has escalated beyond the scope of an ordinary grievance," Kaller announced, their voice resonating like a bell. "The council demands answers." Arvex stood, his posture rigid and unyielding. "Honored representatives, the Veqeth acted to reclaim what is rightfully ours. The human and his interference are an affront to our traditions. The Korlak must be returned to Veqeth custody immediately." A murmur of discontent rippled through the room, but before anyone could speak, Jake rose. "With all due respect," Jake said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "Vyrkon's not an object to be claimed. He's a living being with agency. He made his choice." Arvex hissed, his slitted pupils narrowing. "And you, a human, presume to understand the will of a Korlak better than we, who have lived alongside them for centuries." Jake didn't flinch. "I don't presume anything. I just know what I've seen. Vyrkon isn't following me because I control him. He's here because he trusts me. And trust isn't something you force, it's something you earn." Kaller tilted their crystalline head, their light refracting in curious patterns. Lieutenant Marlowe raises an intriguing point. If the Korlak truly acts of its own volition, it could signal a new understanding of their nature. "This is heresy," Arvex snapped, his tail lashing furiously. "Korlaks are warriors, hunters. Their loyalty is to the Veqeth alone." "Then why did Vyrkon stand with me instead of following your operatives?" Jake countered. The room fell silent. Arvex's jaw clenched, his claws flexing against the table. Kaller broke the tension with a soft chime. "The council requires evidence. Lieutenant Marlowe, would you be willing to demonstrate the nature of your bond with the Korlak?" Jake hesitated, glancing at Vyrkon, who sat beside him, calm but watchful. "What kind of demonstration?" Something more challenging than a simulated environment, Collar said. A true test of the bond. Arvex's eyes gleamed with a predatory light. If the human is so confident in his bond, let him prove it on Veqeth Prime. A ripple of surprise passed through the chamber. Collar tilted their head again. An intriguing suggestion. Arvex, elaborate. The wilds of Veqeth Prime are where Korlax are born and raised, Arvex said, his voice filled with venomous pride. If this bond is as strong as the human claims, let them survive there for 3 days, alone. Jake frowned. And by alone I assume you mean surrounded by wild Korlax that think I'm dinner. Arvex's lips curled into a cruel smile. Precisely. Collar considered this for a moment. It is a dangerous proposition, but it would resolve the matter conclusively. Lieutenant Marlowe, do you accept this challenge? Jake looked down at Vyrkon, who met his gaze with unwavering confidence. Yeah, Jake said, we'll do it. 2 days later, Jake and Vyrkon stood on the surface of Veqeth Prime, surrounded by a jungle that felt alive with movement. The air was thick with humidity, and strange calls echoed through the trees. The wild beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but Jake knew it concealed dangers at every turn. From a high ridge, Arvex and a group of Veqeth observers watched. The rules are simple, Arvex said, addressing Jake from above. Survive for 3 days. Find your way to the extraction beacon, and you will have proven your bond. Fail and nature will decide your fate. Jake nodded, adjusting the lightweight survival gear he'd been issued. Got it. Anything else I should know? Arvex smirked. Yes, do not expect mercy. With that, the Veqeth delegation departed, leaving Jake and Vyrkon alone. The first day was a trial of endurance. The jungle was an unforgiving maze of dense foliage, hidden pitfalls, and venomous creatures. Jake relied on his survival training to gather food and fashion a rudimentary shelter, but it was Vyrkon who truly carried the day. The Korlax's keen senses detected threats long before they appeared, and his sheer presence warded off smaller predators. Jake quickly realized that Vyrkon wasn't just a protector, he was a partner. Good boy, Jake said that evening, tossing Vyrkon a piece of dried meat as they settled in for the night. Vyrkon caught it with practiced ease, his tail wagging slightly. By the second day, the true challenges began. They encountered their first wild Korlax, a massive, scarred beast with silver fur and glowing red eyes. It let out a bone-rattling roar, its claws tearing through the underbrush as it charged. Jake braced himself, but Vyrkon stepped forward, growling deeply. The two Korlax circled each other, communicating in low, guttural sounds that Jake couldn't interpret. Finally, the wild Korlax huffed and retreated into the shadows. Jake exhaled, his hands shaking. Okay, you're officially the best teammate ever. On the third day, as they neared the extraction point, disaster struck. A pack of wild Korlax ambushed them, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. Jake and Vyrkon fought side by side, Jake wielding a sharpened branch while Vyrkon used his speed and strength to hold the attackers at bay. Despite their efforts, the pack forced them into a narrow ravine. Injured and exhausted, Jake slumped against the rocky wall, his breath ragged. This might be it, buddy, he muttered. Vyrkon let out a deep growl, standing protectively in front of Jake. As the pack closed in, Vyrkon roared a sound so powerful it echoed through the ravine like thunder. To Jake's astonishment, the wild Korlax froze. One by one, they lowered their heads and backed away, disappearing into the jungle. Jake stared in disbelief. What just happened? Vyrkon turned to him, his yellow eyes calm and steady. He let out a soft huff and nudged Jake gently, as if to say, "Get up, we're not done yet." When they finally reached the extraction beacon, battered but alive, the Veqeth observers were waiting. Arvex's expression was a mixture of shock and reluctant respect. "You survived," Arvex said, his voice tight. Jake grinned, despite the exhaustion etched on his face. "Told you we would." Arvex stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Vyrkon. "You have proven your bond. The Council will honor its decision." Jake extended a hand. "Maybe this doesn't have to be the end. We could learn a lot from each other, you know." Arvex hesitated, then clasped Jake's hand briefly. Perhaps. The jungle trial had concluded, but the echoes of its outcome resonated far beyond Veqeth Prime. News of Jake and Vyrkon's survival and the remarkable display of their bond spread across the Galactic Alliance like wildfire. For some, it was a symbol of hope, a testament to the possibilities of understanding between species. For others, particularly the more traditionalist factions of the Veqeth, it was a bitter pill to swallow. The Veqeth Council, led by Arvex, begrudgingly acknowledged Jake's success. Vyrkon was officially recognized as Jake's companion, and the Veqeth's claim to the Korlak was formally dropped. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Back on the diplomatic station, Jake hoped life would settle into something resembling normalcy. Instead, his quarters turned into an interstellar tourist attraction. Eager representatives of various species clamored for a glimpse of Vyrkon. Some came to marvel, some to challenge, and others simply out of curiosity. Jake quickly lost track of the number of times he had to explain Earth's concept of dogs, always ending with some variation of, "Yes, he's like a dog. No, he's not for sale." Commander Mert was less amused by the attention. "Jake, I'm running out of ways to tell people that the Earth delegation is not hosting a zoo exhibit," she said, pacing furiously in her office. Jake, seated across from her, shrugged. "Hey, I'm not the one sending reporters to my door. Maybe they should be mad at Arvex for trying to kidnap Vyrkon." Mert shot him a glare. "Speaking of Arvex, he's been unusually quiet since you got back, and that worries me." "Maybe he's finally accepted that Vyrkon likes me better," Jake said with a grin. "Or maybe he's planning something worse," Mert countered. "Just stay on guard. And for the love of all that's holy, don't let Vyrkon eat anyone." Mert's concerns proved valid sooner than Jake expected. 3 days later, during a routine council session, Arvex made an unexpected announcement. "The Veqeth delegation proposes a new resolution," he declared, his voice calm but icy, "to formally establish the Korlak as an exclusive symbol of Veqeth's strength, untethered from outside interference." Jake frowned, exchanging a glance with Vyrkon, who sat alert at his side. The proposal wasn't just about reaffirming the Veqeth's claim over the Korlaks, it was a thinly veiled attempt to erase everything Jake and Vyrkon had demonstrated. The council chairperson tilted their crystalline head. This resolution would undo the results of Lieutenant Marlowe's trial, which were agreed upon by this council. "What justification do you offer?" Arvex's gaze turned toward Jake, his slitted pupils narrowing. "The trial proved nothing but the human's luck. The true bond between Korlak and handler cannot be replicated outside of Veqeth tradition. To allow this so-called bond to continue is to dilute the very essence of what the Korlak represents." Jake stood, his fists clenched. "This isn't about tradition. It's about control. You're afraid that if other species see what Vyrkon and I have, they'll realize the Korlaks aren't just weapons for you to parade around." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Arvex's tail lashed, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "You misunderstand, human," he said. "This is not fear, it is principle. The Korlak belongs to Veqeth culture. What you have done is steal a piece of our identity." "Steal?" Jake shot back. "I didn't steal anything. Vyrkon made his own choice. Maybe that's what you're really afraid of, that the Korlaks aren't as loyal to you as you think." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Kaller raised a crystalline hand to restore order. "The council will deliberate on this proposal," they said. "In the meantime, the bond between Lieutenant Marlowe and the Korlak remains recognized." That night, Jake found himself pacing his quarters, his mind racing. Vyrkon watched him from his usual spot by the bed, his yellow eyes calm but attentive. "This isn't going to stop, is it?" Jake said, running a hand through his hair. "No matter what we do, Arvex is going to keep coming after us." Vyrkon huffed softly and stood, patting over to nudge Jake's hand with his massive snout. The gesture was comforting, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He dropped to one knee, meeting Vyrkon's gaze. "I don't know how this ends, buddy. But I'm not giving you up. Not now. Not ever." Vyrkon licked Jake's face, his tail wagging gently. The next day, Jake was called back to the council chamber for the final vote on Arvex's resolution. The chamber was packed, the air thick with anticipation. The caller struck the table to silence the crowd. The council has reviewed the Veqeth's proposal. We recognize the cultural significance of the Korlak to the Veqeth people, but we also recognize the precedent set by Lieutenant Marlowe's trial. After much deliberation, the council has reached a decision. The room fell silent. The resolution is denied. A wave of relief washed over Jake as murmurs of approval rippled through the chamber. But before he could celebrate, Arvex stood, his expression cold and calculating. "Honored representatives," he said, his voice steady. "If the council will not preserve our traditions, then the Veqeth will take matters into our own hands." The weight of his words hung in the air, a thinly veiled threat. Caller tilted their head. "Are you suggesting that the Veqeth would act outside of council jurisdiction?" Arvex's lips curled into a sharp smile. "I am suggesting that some bonds cannot be forged, and some traditions cannot be broken." With that, he turned and left the chamber, his entourage following close behind. In the days that followed, the Veqeth withdrew from several key council initiatives, sparking rumors of secession. Jake, meanwhile, found himself at the center of an intergalactic debate, with some species praising him as a symbol of unity and others decrying him as a disruptor. But through it all, one thing remained constant: his bond with Vyrkon. One evening, as Jake sat on the station's observation deck with Vyrkon at his side, he looked out at the stars and smiled. "We've caused a lot of trouble, haven't we?" he said. Vyrkon huffed, resting his head on Jake's lap. Jake chuckled, scratching behind the Korlak's ears. "Yeah, but I wouldn't change a thing." For Jake and Vyrkon, the journey was far from over. The challenges ahead would be daunting, but they faced them together, proving that even in the vast expanse of the galaxy, bonds of trust and friendship could transcend tradition. And somewhere on Veqeth Prime, the wild Korlaks howled at the stars, their cries echoing a truth the Veqeth refused to admit: change was coming.